Hello, everyone. I'm Alex, the business lead at WeatherXM, here today with Nikos, our CTO. And today we're going to be talking about our hardware lineup. So, hey, Nikos, how you doing?
Hello, Alex. I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Happy to have you. Yeah, well, today I'm excited to talk about our hardware products.
Yeah,
So maybe you can give us a quick intro and overview of our three different types of products. We have a Wi-Fi, a Helium, and 4G. So maybe you can
yeah,
give us some insight.
yeah, sure.
And then what's like the ideal use case, or what should someone do before they're about to purchase the Helium
Yeah.
device?
First factor, as I said, is to check what kind of connectivity you have. And also, maybe you don't want to like mess with gateways and stuff like that. I mean, it's a nice little thing. I
Hmm.
can show it in the gateways, these little beautiful things that shows you the
Ah, yeah.
measurements in
There it
real
is.
time. But if you don't want to mess with any gateways, you don't want to have this thing plugged in your home, you just get a Helium, okay? And for the factor for whether selecting the cellular model, the 4G, let's say, or not, is really a restriction. Like you have no other way to connect to our network. It is a remote installation area,
Sure.
maybe somewhere in the mountains or in the fields or something.
Yeah, I think like one customer that I like to talk about is PG&E because I think
Mm-hmm.
they use a combination of cellular and helium models.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I think we might not highlight enough is that the helium model is great for that low connectivity area, but low connectivity is also great to collect fire related weather data. And so I
Mm-hmm.
always thought that was quite interesting. They were using it because they're putting, weather stations in areas with literally no cellular or Wi-Fi connectivity. So they'd have to set up a helium gateway, and then they'd attach our weather station way out in the wilderness. So I always thought that was an interesting
Yeah,
use case. Is fire weather is collection is great for the
yeah,
helium station.
you are right that there's also one more special case when it comes to installing, choosing between Wi-Fi and Helium stations, is that if you don't have coverage, if you don't have Wi-Fi coverage in an area, let's say you want to install a weather station in a remote village, like
Hmm.
or around the village, um, with one Helium gateway, you can, by installing one single Helium gateway, you can add coverage to an area around it, which could go many kilometers. So you can install multiple weather stations with just one gateway. This is one advantage of the Helium station.
Hmm.
Whilst with
And
the
what
Wi-Fi version, you would need multiple. Anyway,
well, so when you install Wi-Fi, you don't really need to consider the coverage, right? You just put on your house generally, and you
yeah,
have the Wi-Fi up and running, right? But for Helium, what map do you use to check coverage, right? If someone doesn't have the gateway themselves, where can they go?
Helium Explorer is a pretty good indication that if there is coverage in the area. Still, it's good.
If
It's
you're
good
not
enough in most cases.
if you're not setting up your own gateway, definitely check
Hmm.
that out before
Yeah,
purchasing
yeah,
the Helium. But it brings the bigger question to me is when you were first planning out the WeatherXM network, what made you determine the specific sensors you put on these models, right? Because they all have the same sensors.
yeah.
So how did you determine that's what you wanted to go to market with? So, precip, humidity, all of them. Why did you pick these six types of data points to collect when, deciding to build out our hardware?
It's actually seven. I mean, you mean the
Seven.
seven parameters. So it's the seven most important parameters that every commercial weather station should have. Even if you, for example, if you try to obtain data from any kind of third-party service, most of these services they will have those parameters. It's like the bread and butter of weather of meteorologists. They need that to draw any conclusions. Now, of course, there are more parameters. There are weather stations that measure extra parameters, and these usually belong to a more advanced range. They are more expensive, harder to maintain. This is what we call industrial weather stations here at WeatherXM, and we're also preparing one offering in this range very soon.
Sure, yeah. And so how do you view the different type of customer who's going to be buying this industrial? Like, can I as a retail user just go put this new station in my backyard, or
Yes,
do you foresee a different use case?
so yes, you can actually do it because all of our weather stations they can be installed by non-trained professionals or non-trained people. You don't have to be a professional, but I think the price point is, and I mean, what you're looking in a weather station is what is the deciding factor here. So the industrial weather station is usually it will. We're talking about our new product, by the way, now. So I'm going to reveal quite a few stuff. But an industrial weather station can be much more expensive than a personal one, and will be much more expensive. So usually they measure a few more parameters and with better precision than the personal ones that are already very good. And so that's why they usually aim towards more, let's say, advanced use cases. You mentioned PG&E earlier. A customer like PG&E is mostly interested in weather stations of this caliber.
Well, I was also thinking, I live in Washington State. It's pretty cold. I'm not in a mountainous region at the moment, but I know some of our personal weather stations, if you bring them in very extreme climates, they might not be able to capture, 150-mile-an-hour winds, or they might, not be able to capture negative 50 degrees. So, can you give me where the extremes, where this industrial station might capture versus where our personal weather stations might not?
Okay, I will try to using metric units. Apologies for that, and
That's
then
fine. Yeah.
you can convert for those. Oh yeah, indeed. Usually the industrial sensors, they push the limits in the range that they can measure. Even though the personal weather stations that we have, they are very resilient to extreme weather already. We have many weather stations installed in northern areas where every winter the temperature reaches minus 40 or something. It's very typical, but minus 40 is also the limit here for these weather stations. The industrial sensors tend to go to a little bit more extreme limits in every parameter. For example, the personal weather stations that we have now, they go up to 50 meters per second max wind, which is already crazy. It's like you can see flowers and cars and cows flying if you.
Well, it's crazy considering how small the weather station is, right?
Yeah, and at this point, at these extreme conditions, the problem now becomes more the installation that you do than the actual weather station itself. I mean, you will need to do pretty good installation. But still, the industrial weather stations, they go 60 meters per second, which is they're always pushing the limits.
More accurate?
It is more accurate, okay. Yes, because as the parameters, it's usually the wind that. As it goes higher, the accuracy is also the tolerance is lower. So these weather stations, the professional ones, they not only go into a larger range, extreme values, but they also are more accurate as these values grow. So maybe they both can work at 50 meters per second, but the industrial one will be giving you yes, exactly.
Okay. And so will the industrial model have any certifications from meteorological organizations or?
So that's a tough question because yes and no at the same time. The weather stations that we're planning to use are tried and tested for very reputable manufacturers and they are actually used in a lot of industrial use cases all over the world. So they come with certifications that for at least some of their parameters, but not all of them, which doesn't mean that they cannot measure accurately, but most of these certifications are there for, let's say, academic by a very small percentage of people that are very into weather, let's say academics. And for example, in order to get certifications from WMO for wind speed, for accuracy at wind speed, you have to go over 60 meters per second. Your weather station has to be able to measure 60 meters per second, which is actually covered by our industrial offering that's coming. But this also requires the weather station to be installed very high, at 10 meters or something at this height, which is insane. If you install it lower, your weather station passes the certification, but the installation is not. And it also
I got you.
It also restricts you, if you want to, it dictates that the rain cap that measures the rain should be installed at a different location than the weather station, than the wind. But our weather stations are the compact versions, which means it's an all-in-one and it is a single unit. So there's no way that this part of the certification can apply to this weather station. It's not that the weather station doesn't pass this certification. It doesn't even apply to it.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. So I know we've talked quite a bit about the new upcoming industrial stations. Do you plan to make any improvements on the current, home weather stations, personal weather stations?
Yeah, so we're constantly working on improvements on the firmware. You'll see from time to time new firmware being released. We always announce it in Discord. And usually these updates include fixes, improvements on measurements, on speed, things like that. But we're also planning to include some new improvements related to user experience. So we're going to add new features that improve maybe the onboarding process, the configuration of the station, stuff like that.
Okay. And
Yeah, so be on the
speaking
lookout.
to speaking of new firmware though, can you give me like some best practices when setting up a station or any common mistakes that people run into when first setting it up?
Yeah, I'm always amazed at the imagination of some of our users. Thankfully, the majority follows like all instructions, like to every detail. So the installation quality most of the time is great. So kudos to our community. But I always see some crazy stuff, and the typical mistake that people do is like installing the weather station next to a wall or next to a building, and then expect it to measure wind properly, but you cannot measure wind if there's a wall on the way. I mean, there's no wind. And then they also expect to get the full rewards and not get penalized, which is not possible. Thankfully, we have quite a few mechanisms that exactly do this, like make sure that the users install it properly. But like the rule of thumb here is to look around the weather station and make sure that there are no obstacles, and make sure that the nearest obstacle, if it's like 2 meters high, make sure that it's also at least 2 meters away from the station. And of course, use a high enough pole. You need a 2 meter pole. It has to be high enough. And this is all. I
Yeah.
mean, don't install it on on your balcony. It's installed on a roof or on a fence on a pole far away, something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it looks like our producer really wants me to ask you this question. So I'd like you to explain how we move from the M5 to the D1 and from the H1 to the H2, and what the benefits are of these improved stations.
Yeah, I think the producer asks these questions for himself because he wants to upgrade. So he hijacks this discussion and okay, I will do it for you. Anyway, we've talked about this in the previous video by the way. So upgrading from M5 to D1 will not, let's make it clear, any of those updates mentioned from M5 to D1 or from H1 to H2 will not offer you any like increase in rewards because the data quality is the same. In both these cases, the improvements were on UX. So to be more specific, on M5 and D1, the two main improvements were that the GPS receiver is now placed in the stations. So the days where you had to put your M5 anywhere you wanted, but you had to run a long cable with an antenna to your window to make sure that it gets a GPS signal. These days are over because now the GPS receiver is inside the station. And one very important improvement also is that it now uses the LoRa protocol and not GFSK, which is more resilient to signal interference and is also more long range. So we had cases where the weather station was like 500 meters away or even more away from the gateway, and it worked perfectly. This is on D1. This is the D1 that works with the LoRa. And yeah, this is pretty much it when it comes to improvements on the D1. And from H1 to H2, even though it sounds like it is a big jump because it's a whole number, like Terminator 1, Terminator 2, completely different movies, but the stations are essentially the same. Those stations, they had the H2 over H1, it had minor improvements in the hardware of the station to make sure that it's more resilient to dirt and dust, meaning the bearings are actually improved, so they do not get dirty as easily. It's not like we had problem with H1, but was an easy improvement. So we decided one of the batches of the Helium stations to improve on those things. And one that I forgot is also that the H2 has its sensor, a temperature and humidity sensor, more easily replaceable. So it's again on the UX side, the improvement.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. And I also wanted to follow up on our previous conversation. When can we expect the industrial product to come out?
So we're working on the industrial station as we speak. It's still in beta, let's say. We're planning to launch it Q1 of 25. We're going to run internal, and we're already running internal tests, like internal pilots, and we're probably going to run more expanded pilots, maybe inside some selected with the help of some users of our community, possibly. But the launch is aimed towards end of Q1, maybe February or March. One important thing is that we're working actually on 2 industrial weather stations, so there might be a surprise and there will be 2 instead of 1. There will be twins, even though we were expecting only a boy.
I didn't know that. That is exciting. Okay. That's new information for me too.
Yeah.
Well, and so when I purchase this, or when someone purchases this, can they expect more rewards? Are they collecting more data?
So
What
then that
insight can you give there?
okay, I do not want to like reveal a lot of stuff, but we were talking about weather station hardware classes like early in the days of the project, and I think we are going to introduce them soon, I believe. We're working towards this, but it may not be at the time of launch. To elaborate, the hardware classes are like the classification of weather stations into categories, where the more expensive industrial ones, because they are going to offer more parameters, as I mentioned. I mean, we're also experimenting with snow, for example, with some of the weather stations we're working with. They have to be rewarded more, a little bit more, at least a little bit more. So we are planning to make this classification in the future, where more advanced weather stations, since they are offering more advanced data, they will receive more rewards. And there will not be a crazy difference, but there will be a difference.
So when you say more advanced data, you just mean more data variables, or
More
since the
data
data is more
parameters, yes.
accurate?
More
Okay, more
data variables.
parameters.
I mean, some industrial weather stations, they detect lightning, for example. Others, they have the capabilities to differentiate rain from snow and also hail. So we're working also on adding very advanced parameters, and we have to differentiate those from the personal weather stations, and they even have a very different price point. I mean, the difference is quite significant. Yeah.
Okay, well, this is all great information. Do you have any final thoughts, any last words you'd like to share with our community before you sign off today?
Well, not something very important. I just wanted to say that I'm very grateful for the community we have. We have quite an active Discord, and other communities that are not in Discord, we are monitoring those. We are taking notes, even though we are not, some of us, we have people dedicated to Discord, but back in the day, there were many of us very active on Discord. And even though some of us are not still active in Discord, we are monitoring, noting down feedback, and we are very grateful for the community that is supporting us. Some of those members, they were with us since the beginning, and we really appreciate every single one of the users that stays with us. And this is a thank you for the community, pretty much.